the early 80s and 1990s, there were probably only about 20 to 30 Florida Panthers left in the wild.
I mean, that's pretty close to extinct.
By the early 1990s, only 26 Florida Panthers were left alive on Earth. Not 26,000, 26. And they weren't just rare, they were falling apart from the inside, their bodies breaking down in ways that told scientists this species had maybe 20 years left before it vanished for good. Then someone made a decision that sounded completely insane. Capture 8 wild cougars in the mountains of West Texas, fly them across the country, and set them loose in a Florida swamp. 8 cats. That was the whole plan to save an entire species.
The wildlife success story continues to unfold in Florida. Once on the very brink of extinction, the Florida panther is slowly making a comeback. The progress has been captured in a newly released National Geographic documentary.
What happened next changed everything. The last 26. To understand why anyone would try something that desperate, you have to go back a few years, down to the swamps west of Miami, and look at what was actually happening to these cats. Because they were not just rare. 26, that was the number. 26 wild Florida Panthers left on the entire planet, all of them crowded into the bottom corner of one state. And they were not simply dwindling the slow, sad way endangered animals usually do. They were coming apart from the inside. Their tails had started to bend. Right at the base, the bone kinked into a hard, unnatural angle, like a finger snapped and healed crooked. The males were worse off. Among the males born between 1990 and 1992, roughly 80% had only one descended testicle, or none at all. Their hearts had tiny holes in them, holes that a veterinarian could actually hear as a murmur through a stethoscope out in the field. And their sperm counts had fallen so far that most of them could barely reproduce even when they tried. Then there was the strangest sign of all, the one written right into their fur. A whorl of hair along the spine, a cowlick, was showing up in 94% of the population. In healthy puma groups everywhere else in the Americas, that same little defect appears in under 10% of animals, 94% against under 10. That is not bad luck. That is a warning written in hair. Think about what all of that adds up to. These cats were not being killed by a predator, or a disease, or a hard winter. They were being killed by their own genetics, by generation after generation of the same tiny family breeding with itself, until every single kitten was born carrying a stack of broken instructions from both parents at once. In 1992, a team of biologists sat down, ran the numbers, and came back with a verdict that reads less like a study and more like a sentence. The Florida panther, they said, had a 95% chance of being gone within 20 years. Gone, not endangered, extinct, hunted to nothing. Now this is the part that makes the whole thing ache a little more. The Florida panther did not stumble into that corner of the map by accident. We put it there. Rewind about 30 years before the crisis, and these cats were not dying of bad genes at all. They were being hunted, shot, trapped, run down, killed for bounties, all across the American Southeast. There was a time when panthers moved through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and South Carolina, an animal woven right through the whole region. And one by one, state by state, we erased them. By the time Florida finally made it illegal to kill them in 1958, the damage was so complete that almost nobody believed there were any wild panthers left to protect in the first place. For most of the 1960s, that was the honest state of things. Wildlife officials in Florida could not confirm that a single breeding panther still existed anywhere in the state. The animal had slipped into the realm of rumor, a track pressed into the mud, a long tail vanishing into the palmetto, a story somebody's uncle swore up and down was true. Nobody could prove the panther was still out there, and nobody could prove it wasn't. So in 1972, the World Wildlife Fund decided to settle the question for good. And they went and hired the one man who might actually know how to find a ghost. His name was Roy McBride, a lion tracker out of West Texas. And yes, the same Roy McBride who would be standing in those frozen canyons 2 decades later. His job back in 1972 was brutally simple. Go into the Florida wild and tell us the truth. Is this animal already extinct? It took him about a year, and the answer was no, but only barely. McBride found them, holding on in the wetlands near Lake Okeechobee. What he found, though, was not really a population. It was the last flickering ember of one, tiny, cut off from every other cougar on the continent, and already, even then, showing the first faint cracks of the collapse that was coming. Sit with the cruelty of that for a second. The Panther had survived everything we threw at it, every gun and trap and bounty. What it could not survive was being locked in a room with nobody but its own relatives. The brick wall. By the early 1980s, biologists finally started getting their hands on the survivors, and this is where the story stops being about numbers and starts being about a person. Her name was Melody Rolke, and she was the veterinarian doing much of the hands-on work, out in the sawgrass and the cypress, darting cats, drawing blood, fitting radio collars, giving vaccines. Picture the conditions she was working in: heat pressing down, water up to her knees, an unconscious predator laid across her lap, and a very short window to learn everything she possibly could before it woke back up. Rolke went in expecting a small population under stress. That is the reasonable thing to expect. What she actually found stopped her cold, because this was not stress. This was a slow-motion medical emergency, unfolding one cat at a time. The heart murmurs, the undescended testicles, the barely viable sperm. Immune systems so worn down that parasites simply overran them, and ordinary infections, the kind a healthy cougar would shrug off in a day, were killing Florida Panthers by the dozen. Imagine being the person kneeling in that swamp, cataloging defect after defect, slowly coming to understand that you are not looking at a sick animal, you are looking at a sick species. Rolke described it as the population hitting a biological brick wall, and once you understand what she was seeing out there, that phrase lands like a diagnosis. She needed to know how deep the rot went, so she packaged up genetic samples and shipped them north to a geneticist named Stephen O'Brien working within the National Institutes of Health. Now, picture the other end of that shipment. O'Brien in a lab hundreds of miles away from any swamp, running the analysis, watching the numbers come in. And what those numbers told him was staggering. The Florida Panther carried less genetic variation than almost any large mammal population that had ever been studied. Not a species, really, not anymore. A handful of extended families mating with one another around and around and around for generations. And the math underneath it was merciless. Of the couple dozen panthers left, only 6 females were breeding at all. 6. And the kittens those 6 were producing were dying young, or born deformed, or growing up sterile, which meant this tiny population was not just small, it was actively shrinking its own future with every litter it made. By 1992, every biologist who looked at the data landed in exactly the same place. Leave it alone, and the Florida Panther is gone inside 20 years. That was the wall all of them were standing in front of. And a few of them decided they were simply not going to stand there and watch it happen. If you are the kind of person who wants the full story behind a moment like this, the desperate plan a species comes down to when nothing else is left, take a second to subscribe. The American Wild follows species comebacks, conservation battles, and the quiet ecological turning points that shape the wildlife around us. What a handful of scientists decided to do next is exactly why this channel exists. A radical plan. In October of 1992, the people who might actually do something gathered at a place called White Oak Plantation, a conservation center up in northern Florida. Get that room in your head for a second. Geneticists, wildlife biologists, federal officials from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state managers, representatives from the National Park Service, serious people, careful people, career people, all sitting around a table to seriously discuss an idea that, on paper, sounds almost reckless. The idea had a clinical name: genetic augmentation. Strip away the jargon, though, and here is what it actually meant. Go and get female cougars from a different, healthier puma population, fly them into Florida, turn them loose, and let them breed with the surviving Florida males. The kittens that came out of those pairings would carry brand new genetic material, DNA that had never once been run through the Florida family tree, never folded and refolded through all that inbreeding. In theory, the defects would dilute. In theory, the population would start to heal. In theory, the single most important decision in the whole plan was where to get the cats. And the team landed on Texas for a reason that really matters. A long time ago, before South Florida got walled off into its own genetic island, Panthers and Texas Cougars used to meet naturally, out at the edges of their ranges, and mix. So, Texas pumas were not some foreign species being bolted onto the panther. They were cousins, distant relatives separated by a few centuries of geography, being quietly reintroduced to the family. But not everybody in that world believed it was a good idea. And this is the part where you have to meet the doubt head-on, in the form of a man named Stuart Pym, a conservation ecologist at Duke University. Pym had spent a career thinking about exactly this kind of intervention, and his worry was not a small one. His fear was that pouring outside genes into the panther might erase the Florida panther as its own distinct thing entirely, that you would not be saving the animal at all. You would be replacing it with something else and stapling the old name on top, and he was far from alone in that fear. Then stack on top of it the raw, physical risk of the thing. Nobody had ever attempted a genetic rescue like this on a wild population of big cats. Release 8 Texas Cougars into the Everglades, and if it goes wrong, there is no undo button. You cannot recall the cats. You cannot unmix the genes. So that was the choice sitting on the table. Do something unprecedented and possibly ruinous, or do nothing and watch a species blink out inside a single human lifetime. Even the money became a problem because the cost of flying the Cougars across the country had not been budgeted by anyone until the National Parks Conservation Association stepped up and agreed to cover the flights themselves. And then, in January of 1995, every federal and state agency in that room gave the final green light. The plan was real now. It was happening, and it needed exactly one man to walk up into the mountains and catch the cats. The hunter returns. Which brings us right back to where we started this whole thing. Roy McBride, 58 years old, in the winter of 1995, heading up into the West Texas high country with the strangest assignment of his life. And you have to understand who this man actually was, because it is almost too perfect to be real. McBride was born in 1936, out in country so remote that going to town meant a 100-mile drive to a little place called Alpine. He grew up tracking mountain lions across some of the most punishing terrain in North America. Canyon country, cold, vertical, unforgiving. The kind of landscape that quietly kills people who don't know it. Weeks alone up in that country. Freezing nights, thin air, the whole world tilted at a hard angle, tracking an animal that does not want to be found by a man who had spent 60 years learning exactly how it thinks. And he knew it. He knew it better than almost anyone alive. His reputation ran so deep that the novelist Cormac McCarthy leaned on him, drew on his knowledge of the borderlands, while he was building his own fiction. But here is the twist that makes McBride's place in this story land so hard. In his younger years, he had not been saving mountain lions. He had been killing them. He hunted cougars for ranchers and for government bounties. And by some accounts, he did as much as any single human being alive to push the mountain lion toward the edge in Texas. Read that again and let it settle. The man now being sent to rescue a dying cat had decades earlier been one of the most effective cat killers in the entire state. The one who helped empty the mountains was the one they trusted to go and fill a swamp. And picture how he actually did it, because it is nothing like what you would imagine. No helicopters, no tranquilizer drones. McBride worked the old way, the hard way. He led a blindfolded mule up through the crags and the canyons, blindfolded so it would stay calm on the narrow ledges where a spooked animal means a dead one. And he used his dogs and his own tracking to flush the cats out of the caves and the rimrock where they were hiding. One cold day at a time, one cat at a time. Across the early months of 1995, he caught 8 females. He got them ready for the strangest trip of their lives, loaded them onto the planes, and pointed them toward Florida. Whatever happened after that was completely out of his hands. McBride had done his part. 8 cats loose. The first one to touch down in Florida was a 4-year-old female with a plain, bureaucratic name, Texas 104, healthy, strong, a West Texas mountain lion right in the prime of her life. She landed in March of 1995 and got placed into a holding pen, where the plan was for her to spend about a week just acclimating, getting slowly used to the wet heat, the standing water, the completely alien world of the South Florida swamp before anyone turned her loose. And think about what that pen must have felt like to her. She was a desert animal, built for dry rock and cold air and 100-mile horizons, suddenly dropped into a wet, green, buzzing box where the heat never broke and the water never drained. Everything about the place was wrong for her body, and she had no way of knowing she was supposed to be the beginning of something. She lasted one day. When her handlers opened the enclosure to bring her water, Texas 104 did not wait around for the plan. She bolted straight past them and vanished into the Everglades in a matter of seconds. No acclimation, no release strategy, no tracking team in position. One of the most important animals in the entire project was simply gone, swallowed whole by the swamp before the experiment had even officially begun. She would survive out there for 3 years before being shot dead in 1998 by a person who was never identified, for a reason nobody ever learned. The rest of the cats went out across the spring and summer of 1995, scattered through Everglades National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, and the wild country folded in between. Picture one of those releases: a crate door swinging open at the edge of a cypress stand, a Texas cat pausing for 1 single second at the threshold of a landscape unlike anything in her genetic memory, and then gone straight into the green. By the end of that summer, all 8 Texas Cougars were loose somewhere in South Florida, and then the losses started, before any of the promise could be paid out. 3 of the 8 never got the chance to matter at all. One was struck and killed by a vehicle on a highway. Another was shot dead under unclear circumstances, and she had been pregnant when she died. A third died under conditions the officials would only ever describe as somewhat cloudy. So do the subtraction with me. 8 became 5. 5 Texas females, scattered somewhere across hundreds of square miles of swamp, expected to find and breed with Florida males whose bloodlines had been collapsing in on themselves for generations. The entire experiment, the whole future of the subspecies, now came down to those 5 cats. Hold on to that number. 5. Something changed. For about 3 years, everyone just waited. And then the biologists tracking the Panthers started seeing something that honestly stunned even the people who had fought the hardest to make this plan happen. The 5 surviving Texas females had found the Florida males. They had bred, and their kittens were being born clean. Think about everything that word carries here. No kinked tails, no cowlicks running up the spine, no holes in the heart, no murmurs. The young males were coming out with their testicles in the right places. That entire grim checklist of defects that had defined a whole generation of Florida Panthers was just not showing up in these kittens. Not diluted, not merely reduced. In litter after litter, simply gone. And it kept going. Across the years that followed, those 5 Texas Pumas were documented producing at least 20 mixed ancestry Panthers. And every one of those kittens grew up and bred with other Panthers, carrying that fresh genetic material deeper and deeper into what had been a closed, dying, inbred population. When the researchers measured heterozygosity, which is really just the technical word for genetic diversity, for how much variety is actually left in the gene pool, the numbers climbed. Within about a decade of the introductions, that diversity had roughly doubled across the broader population. The survival numbers told the story even more bluntly than that. In the years right around the turn of the century, only about 1 in 5 kittens from purely inbred parents was surviving. 1 in 5, but the kittens carrying Texas ancestry, they survived at more than double that rate. And the heart defects in the mixed offspring dropped to roughly half of what still showed up in the purebred cats. It was working. It was actually, measurably, undeniably working. By 2003, the last 2 Texas Pumas still alive in Florida were pulled back out of the wild because they had already done the one thing they were brought in to do. Their genes were loose in the next generation now, spreading on their own. The cats themselves were no longer even necessary. The comeback. From there, it just kept building, slow and quiet, the way real recoveries almost always happen. Not with a bang, but with a number ticking upward year after year, while almost nobody in the world is watching. In 2007, biologists estimated that the panther population had crossed 100 individuals for the first time in modern record keeping. 100. From 26 dying cats to over 100 living ones. Then in 2010, the journal Science published the formal analysis of the entire rescue, and the results were about as good as anyone had ever dared to hope. Panther numbers had roughly tripled since 1995. Genetic diversity had doubled. Survival and fitness had improved across nearly every single measure the researchers were tracking, and the fingerprints of inbreeding were fading right out of the population. One retired Everglades biologist summed it up about as plainly as a person can. In the long, mostly heartbreaking history of trying to save species from ourselves, this one was going to be remembered as a gold star. But the moment that really tells you what this project accomplished came later, in 2017, and it is a quiet one. A female panther was tracked leading her kittens north, across the Caloosahatchee River. And that mattered so much more than it sounds, because it was the first time in more than 40 years that a panther had been documented crossing that river with young. For 4 decades, this species had been penned into one small pocket of South Florida, hemmed in, boxed up. And now here was a mother, calmly walking her kittens into territory the panther had lost before she was ever born, reclaiming ground the species had surrendered generations earlier. For one bright moment, that 95% chance of extinction from 1992 looked like it had been flipped completely on its head. The Florida panther had walked back from the edge, genuinely against every reasonable expectation, back from the edge. The warning. So that could be where the story ends. The comeback, the gold star, the mother and her kittens crossing the river at last. But it does not end there, because in July of 2025, the whole story got complicated all over again. That was when a team of researchers from UCLA and UC Berkeley published a new analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And I want you to picture the lead author, Diana Aguilar Gomez, sitting alone with this data because she was carrying the one fear that had haunted this entire project from its very first day. It was the exact fear Stuart Pym had raised back at the beginning, all those years earlier, the worry that Florida's own genetic identity might have been quietly erased, painted over, completely replaced by Texas DNA, that in the act of saving the panther, we might have accidentally deleted it. And when the genomes finally came back, that decades-old fear got its answer. It had not happened. Florida's local ancestry was still there. These were still, recognizably, Florida panthers, their own distinct genetic character intact underneath the Texas contribution. The infusion had diluted the inbreeding without ever dissolving the subspecies. The nightmare scenario, the extinction by replacement that people like Pym had lost sleep over for 30 years, simply never came to pass. You can only imagine the relief buried inside that one finding. 30 years of a low background dread. The fear that the whole rescue might have been one beautiful mistake. And here at last was the data telling her that it was not. The Florida panther was still the Florida panther. What Roy McBride caught up in those canyons had not overwritten what Melody Rolke fought to save down in that swamp. Both of them were still in there, braided together. But the same analysis surfaced a problem that nobody had fully planned for. Those Texas Cougars, along with an even earlier release of Central American pumas back in the mid-20th century, had carried in harmful mutations of their own. The rescue, it turned out, had not actually reduced the total number of damaging mutations in the population. For right now, those mutations are hidden. The new diversity keeps them recessive, masked, each bad copy of a gene paired up with a healthy one that quietly covers for it, so the damage never shows up in the kittens being born today, for right now. And that little phrase is exactly where the researchers drew a careful, worried line. Their modeling suggested, and I want to be really clear that this is an interpretation, a projection, not a hardened certainty, that the benefits of the whole translocation may not last forever. If the population stays small, hovering somewhere around 200 animals, inbreeding could start creeping upward again. The masked mutations could resurface. The old defects, the kinked tails, and the murmuring hearts could come back, which led the team to one sobering possibility, that another translocation, a second rescue, may eventually be necessary somewhere down the line to keep the panther whole. Not a fact, not a promise, a warning, but a warning worth actually hearing. Borrowed time. And genetics, honestly, might not even be the most urgent threat on the table right now. Because while the scientists worry about the slow, invisible math of the gene pool, there is a faster, dumber, far more brutal danger killing these cats as we speak, and it has nothing at all to do with DNA. It is cars. In 2024, state officials recorded 36 Florida Panthers dead, the highest single-year toll since 2016. And the leading cause was collision with vehicles on Florida's roads. Just 4 months into 2025, 4 more had already been killed the very same way. And it is about to get worse, by design. A planned development of 10,000 homes, dropped right down into panther habitat, is projected to add enough traffic to wipe out the population entirely if it gets built the way it is currently drawn up. Put those two facts side by side for a second. We spent 30 years and an unprecedented scientific gamble dragging this animal back from the edge of extinction. And now, we are seriously considering paving the exact ground it needs to survive. There is a woman named Deborah Jansen who has been watching this species for 3 decades, 30 years of her life, tied to these cats, to their collars and their kittens and their bodies on the side of the road. And when she talks about what scares her the most, it is not the mutations, and it is not even directly the cars. It is us. Her fear is that people will look at everything that has been accomplished here, at the comeback and the gold star and the mother crossing the river, and just quietly decide that it is good enough. That we will shrug, tell ourselves we already tried our best, and let the panther slide right back toward the edge while patting ourselves on the back for the rescue we pulled off 20 years ago. Picture caring about something for 30 years and realizing the biggest threat left standing is simple indifference. Not a bullet, not a bounty, not even a bulldozer really. Just a slow, collective decision to stop paying attention, made by people who will never even know the panther was ever in trouble. That is the quiet way species actually disappear in the modern world. Not with a hunt, with a shrug. Something new. Step back from all of it, and the sheer size of what happened here is genuinely hard to overstate. Because this story stopped being only about Florida a long, long time ago. That 1995 rescue became a template, a proof of concept that scientists all over the world have since copied over and over to pull other small, isolated, collapsing populations back from the same brink. What happened out in the Everglades demonstrated something researchers had only ever been able to argue about in theory, that a population standing at the absolute edge of extinction could, with exactly the right intervention at exactly the right moment, actually recover its biological integrity. That fresh genes could mask old defects just long enough for natural selection to get back to its work. That 5 mountain lions, hauled across an entire continent and dropped into a foreign swamp, could genuinely rewrite the future of an entire subspecies. But you have to hold both halves of this in your hands at the same time because the story flatly refuses to be simple. Genetic rescue is not a cure. It buys time. It does not buy a future. Keeping the Florida panther alive from here on out is going to demand protected habitat, safer roads, maybe that second translocation the 2025 study quietly warned about, and stubborn, sustained political will, handed down through people who will never meet Roy McBride, never meet Melody Rolke, and may never once lay eyes on a wild panther in their entire lives. And here is the plain truth about the cats that are actually out there in South Florida tonight. They are the descendants of 26 dying inbred panthers and 5 Texas Cougars that did exactly what they were brought in to do. They are not pure, not in the way the old genetic records used to measure purity. They are something new. A subspecies that got rescued from itself by an experiment most of the experts fully expected to fail, and whether that rescue holds, or whether the panther slips back toward the edge it just barely climbed away from, is not going to be decided over the next 200 years. It is going to be decided over the next 20, and probably, in the end, by us. If you want more conservation history like this, the kind of quiet, hard-won story that never makes the headlines but shaped the wildlife around us, subscribe to The American Wild, and tell me this in the comments. If the population starts slipping again, should we bring in another round of Texas Cougars, or is there a point where a species has to be allowed to stand on its own? There is a video on screen right now about another animal that came back from the same edge, and what it took to keep it there.